Thanks for joining us on What Matters This Week. I'm Lauren Maloney. Rita Egan from FEMA, Media Relations Specialist, is here this Sunday. Rita, how are you? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Important time of the year, obviously. September is National Preparedness Month.
That is right.
At the end of August in 2011, Vermont, parts of New York, had a really awful thing come to them, in the form of Tropical Storm Irene.
Correct.
And it was forecasted. It's not like nobody knew it was going to happen, but people really didn't think it would happen or be as bad, right?
And that's not uncommon. People always think that, hey, I've lived in this area for a long time. I've seen all the weather. It's not going to be that bad. I can make do. And they're caught off guard frequently.
Yeah. People tend to compare to the last snowstorm or the last major, wind event.
Yes, and it's easy to forget those kind of times. But it's important to note that Mother Nature is going to do what Mother Nature wants. She doesn't pay attention to what our forecasts are or what we think is going to happen. In fact, sometimes I think she decides to snub her nose. But the bottom line is, the one thing that we can do is we can control our response and how we get ready for any possibility. Now, we were talking earlier about most of our disasters that get a presidential declaration are flood related, about 90% actually. But there are a number of events that occur that do not reach the threshold of a federal declaration. And of course, FEMA cannot come in to help anyone unless requested by the governor.
Okay.
And to get to that point, people need to report damages to the local emergency manager.
And they have to meet a certain threshold.
They meet a threshold. That emergency manager collects all the information and just builds it and presents it to the state, and then it goes upward. But there is a way for people to be able to prepare for themselves and become more resilient, and that is through flood insurance. When a situation occurs, you don't have to wait for a federal declaration if you have a flood insurance policy that is separate from homeowners or renters policies, because most of those policies will not cover overland flooding or, say, stream flooding.
Okay.
So flood insurance, if you have it, you call your insurance agent as soon as things start to happen, you put in a claim, obviously document it as best you can, and you can move forward. Other people will be waiting and hoping for a federal declaration. You're already way ahead. And you don't have to pay it back. It's something that if you put in a claim, it's not going to be, oh, you only get to claim one time. So this is an avenue that helps you prepare for your economic well-being. That's going to be my key phrase, throughout all of this. Prepare for your economic well-being, not only for floods, but especially since we're coming into peak hurricane season.
Yeah. You said economic, though. The biggest reason, I would imagine, that most people don't have flood insurance is because they say they can't afford it. And
there is that element. Obviously, if you live in the special flood hazard area, the premiums will be higher than if you live outside of it. I'm going to digress here for a moment. The only way you can buy flood insurance is if your community participates in the flood insurance program. And if they do, then whether you live in the flood area or out of it, you can get flood insurance.
How do you know if your community participates, let's say?
We have a list, and you can go to floodsmart.gov and put in to see if your community actually participates. And it'll identify that. And it'll even help you get an insurance agent if you don't know of one that would sell flood insurance to you. But the community itself can do things to help reduce the cost of the flood insurance, and that is community-wide, and it is a long-term process. But they can do projects maintaining their floodplain management principles, sorry about that, looking at how you develop land and in what parts of the area you're developing, and things of that nature. But the community rating system will help reduce the costs by doing certain things in a specific way. And your hazard mitigation specialists from the state of Vermont would be able to provide specific examples of that, because they are quite active ever since, Hurricane Irene. But there are only 7 communities in the United States, in the entire United States, that have reached a level 1, which is 45% discount on flood insurance. So you have to do quite a bit. It is a lengthy process.
You said there's none in Vermont, though, and none in New Hampshire.
No. neither one. These are usually big projects that have to occur, and it takes a good while. But it, again, is making resiliency a prime factor, not only in your life, but also the community's life. And that's what the state of Vermont, that's what FEMA, that's what we're all striving for. Help individuals get prepared, not only for floods, but other catastrophes, but also communities, because without people, the communities are non-viable. Without the communities, the people won't stay there. So it has to be a combined effort and looking all the way around.
What has Vermont learned since Irene that you've come in contact with as far as people being maybe more aware?
The government of Vermont has been quite vigilant in trying to get more hazard mitigation projects going. And they are working closely with the Region 1 office of FEMA, and again, just pursuing all avenues. I don't have a specific project in mind, but they have been quite adamant in moving forward.
As far as the season so far, I know just a couple of weeks ago in Grafton County, New Hampshire, you know, the president has declared that basically a disaster area, and money from FEMA is headed in that direction.
Yes.
So that was a big issue, and we saw washed out roads. That was something visible to the naked eye. But the everyday person at home, you know, you had mentioned some kind of an event that wouldn't, you know,
meet the
measure
threshold,
up.
right.
So what are those instances?
That's where, you know, staying in touch with your local emergency manager is essential. You may not have noticed it, but the people who traveled those roads would have noticed it immediately. You know, maybe the culverts were gone, you know, so they called it in, and that's where everything starts locally, it ends locally. Again, we come in and we can provide assistance to the state and through the state into that local area. But we cannot do anything beyond that. So by law, it's the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief Act that we work under and through. But it always comes back to that. So that's pretty much it.
But you had said if there was kind of a, I don't want to say minor household or neighboring issue that people had to deal with, if they already had flood insurance, they could put a claim in, and you can start acting right away.
Yes. Otherwise, you're going to wait to see. And for the people who have to wait and see if a federal declaration comes about, if a federal declaration does not come through, then you're looking to the state or voluntary organizations to help you. But again, like we talked earlier, if you had $25,000 worth of damages just from having 1 inch of water on the first floor, you know, and say you did get a grant because it had a federal declaration, the average grant is about $6,000.
It's not going to cover everything.
It's not going to cover everything. So then you're looking at a low interest loan from the Small Business Administration or your local banks. Whereas if you have flood insurance, you know, you could put in a claim and the odds are all of it or most of it would be covered. You know, you're going to be out of pocket much less, if anything.
Has there been a success story that you've heard? Somebody has, you know, thought ahead, bought flood insurance years earlier, needed it, and they were in a kind of maybe a much better situation than maybe a neighbor.
Oh, I have a former coworker who lives in Katy, Texas, not far from Houston, and they had flood insurance on contents and structures. They were way outside of the special flood hazard area, way out, and yet it flooded. Never flooded before, and they didn't put in a claim at all with FEMA because their flood insurance covered everything. They're back in their house, you know. So those are not uncommon stories, you know, especially in certain areas. But that one just happened to be, you know, it took them about 3 months to get back in the house, but they were back in.
As far as other things that might fall under, household issues that might fall under a coverage of flood insurance, what are we talking?
Separate structures. You're going to have it for contents and the primary house, but if you had a garage that was detached, you would need to have a separate policy on that.
Oh, wow.
So that's where things can start adding up, but it depends on what you have in there.
Do people piecemeal just the house?
Yes. And sometimes they won't do it for contents because maybe they're only concerned with certain things and the more important things are upstairs, you know, and it's, you know, like on the second floor or whatever. But that's a decision. But an important point to keep in mind is, like you mentioned, we are about 6 weeks out from peak hurricane season. Okay, it was 1938 was the last time the Northeast took a direct hit from a hurricane. We're not talking a Sandy, we're not talking Irene, we're talking a direct hit from a full-size hurricane, 1938. So it's been a long time. So there's a 30-day waiting period from the time you purchase flood insurance to where it goes into effect. That's why we're out here talking about flood insurance now. Because if you're thinking about it, you want to act within the next, few weeks, if not today and tomorrow, because it could happen again. Like we discussed earlier, 100-year flood, 500-year floods, those are odds every year. So do you feel lucky? And you're the only one that can answer that. How lucky do you feel? Will the floods miss you this year, but maybe come back twice as hard next year? So these are ways that only you can answer, and how well will you be able to rebuild and be resilient and help your community to be resilient? That's all we're all working towards, is think ahead, plan ahead, and look at flood insurance.
Rita, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be right back on What Matters This Week.